Some of you may have read ahead and know we're in Galatians chapter 4, and you can guess what's going on here. But everybody on that list, I wore my Steve Jobs shirt today. Everybody on that list was adopted. Funny thing, eh? The last two people on the list you've probably never heard of. That's because they're my cousins. But they made my list. And in preparation for talking today, because we're talking out of Galatians chapter 4, the first few verses there, and I called up my aunt. It was actually a Skype conversation I had with her, and I wanted to get the background story from her perspective on what it meant to adopt my cousins, because I was young when it happened, and I just remember being super pleased that I had new cousins. And she told me the story, and she told me about how they were foster parents, and they had been foster parents for several different people along the way, and that they had, these two children that had come into their home, and they were young, and their family was kind of trying to get it back together again, and there was this sort of this saga of this ongoing thing of these kids, we're going to go back and back to our old home, and no, we're not, and yeah, we are, and no, we're not, and it was back and forth, and at one point, she said, somebody came and visited, and I think they spent the night or something. She's watching somebody else's kid. So the kid came and was there with them, and then the next morning, mom came to pick the child up, or maybe it was the next day at whatever the appointed time, the parent came and picked the child up, and the child left. And the two foster children just fell apart. They were beside themselves because somebody always came and picked up everybody else, but they never got picked up. And there was always this constant sense of I don't know what comes next. And they were loved, they were in a very loving home, but my aunt and uncle had no intention of adopting them, but they were crushed, and they said that this was a great big emotional event, and all four of them realized at this time something needed to change, something had to be done. And it was enough of the games and the back and forth and whatever else, and so they began to take steps to adopt what eventually became my cousins. And in fact, Chris is one of my best friends to this day. We're one of my closest cousins. So it's kind of a neat story about how, and it wasn't even actually until I was preparing for this talk today that it even dawned on me I don't know, I just remember being struck at one point, wait, they're adopted. Because I've always known that, but you get, they're my cousins. First they're my cousins, but they were adopted, and who cares? It didn't matter. Like, they're my cousins. And in fact, like I said, probably my closest cousin. We're not related by blood. Who cares? We're cousins. That's the power of adoption. It's a pretty neat thing. Actually, funny thing, my family's full of adoption stories. Somewhere on my father's side, starting with my father's mother, because that's as far back as my grandfather's mother, my father's mother, as far back as I know, where our family had trouble having children. And there's this whole miracle that happened involving Amy Simple McPherson and a whole bunch of people that came to know the Lord under a ministry of this lady from Toronto. My great-grandmother was one of the people that was healed and could have children again, but many of the people in the family have not been able to do that. So I have a great aunt who adopted children. I have a great uncle who adopted a child. My father's sister is the one who adopted the two that I was talking about before. It's just been sort of an ongoing thing in our family that adoption's been a part of my family all along, because that's just sort of how our family is. At one point, when I was younger, I was working construction for someone, and he had me stay at his house, and when I was living at his home, he and his wife adopted a baby because they weren't able to have kids. And then as time went on, they proceeded to have a child by in vitro, which is kind of, I guess, an advantage of modern science. So they have one child who's adopted, and one that was their own child by in vitro, and then they adopted another baby, then they had another child that was by in vitro, and so they have these, it's just a mixed family, and it's a neat story about a close friend of mine, and that happened the first of it happened while I was living there. But now there's this thing, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, adoption of what they call snowflake babies. So when they do in vitro, as I understand it, I don't know that I have all the details exactly right, but in vitro is where you unite a sperm and an egg in a petri dish, for lack of a better term, and then they choose some of the resulting embryos, I think I'm using the right word, and plant them, and they grow up to be babies, and the rest of them they freeze in case they need them later. Well, there are a whole bunch of frozen embryos around the world. Funny thing, eh? And if you're like me, you perceive that, a sperm hits an egg, it becomes a human being. It's a living being. And it may be frozen, but it's still a living being, and we call them snowflake babies. So my cousin is a lawyer, and he is in the process of helping these snowflake babies get adopted. Weird things that science does, eh? And then there's this weird thing called adult adoption, but we're not going into that because it gets kind of odd. There's a story about a guy who went, it was rather touching because it told about his experience adopting a child from Kazakhstan. And he said that he had to take tests, and they had the application process, and there were fees involved, and there were people that were doing stuff, and they had to pay for this and to do this, and they had to fly to Kazakhstan, and they had to this, and it just was a huge hassle, like a lot of work to adopt a baby. And the thing that he said that was striking, actually we'll get back to that later. There's a conclusion to that part that I think is kind of interesting. And then, so there's kind of the biological aspects of adoption, kind of the physical aspects of going and getting your child or whatever, and then there's the legal aspect of the actual adoption that takes place. And there's a gentleman who had an experience where his daughter had decided to adopt a child. And they're all before the judge, and the judge says, now because this daughter, she and her husband had other children, and they said, now that when you adopt this baby becomes a part of your family, and it's a lifelong commitment. You are taking on responsibility for this child, and it is a lifelong commitment that you are making, and your children are going to have to share their inheritance with the child that you're adopting. And you need to realize that this is a permanent thing, and this is going to be a shared inheritance going forward. And they were like, yes, that's fine. And then the judge turned to the other siblings and said, okay, guess what? Your parents are considering adopting another child. This child is going to be a shared inheritor with you of your parents' estate when they pass on. And I just need to make sure you're okay with that. And it was just interesting. I guess that's because I'm sniffling, right? Thanks. They just want to make sure that the kids are okay with the fact that they were going to. This is a lifelong commitment. You're now about to accept this child into your home. Adoption is more than just parents adopting a child. It's also siblings accepting the new sibling into the home, and they wanted to make sure with the kids that was okay. And the interesting thing about this particular aspect of it was that he pointed out, from a legal perspective, you got to know what you're doing when you adopt somebody, because even marriage, which is a covenant bond between two people, marriage has divorce. Adoption, there's no going back. If you adopt a child, if you adopt someone else to be your offspring, your heir, you can't undo that. It's permanent. Okay, so lots and lots of talking about the generalities of adoption. We're reading in Galatians, and Galatians actually isn't about adoption at all. The book of Galatians is not about adoption. The book of Galatians is mostly about faith versus the law and the finer aspects of how once you've accepted God through faith, you don't necessarily want to turn around and go backward to try and obey the law, because you can't live under the law. You can't fulfill the law, and fulfilling the law will not bring you into right relationship with God. You will fail. And that was kind of the point of the law, is for us to realize we can't do it. We need somebody to come along. We need somebody else to step out. So the book of Galatians is not about adoption, but there is this one little passage in it that talks about it briefly. And it's almost like an aside. It's not really what it's about. It's more to kind of make the point. And the bigger point is, your relationship with God is by faith, and it is not through the law. And that bigger point is the real one that we're pushing for in Galatians. But what I'm talking about today is sort of a side point that sort of hammers it home. And I am convinced this really hammers it home because it really helps us to see what it all means. So I'm going to put here, we have the passages we're going to read from are Galatians chapter 4, the second part of verses 3 through verse 7. I'm going to take just a second and blow my nose. I was hoping that was going to give a hint to somebody to fix something over there. That didn't happen. She liked the way I walked away from the mic. Okay. Galatians chapter 4. Boy, I'm really sorry. We were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer slaves, but God's children. And since you are his children, he has made you also heirs. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that I want to talk about that comes out of this passage in some of the words that are involved. So starting at the very beginning, we were in slavery under the elemental forces of the spiritual forces of this world, and that's sort of under the law. But when the set time had fully come, and that's not actually the best phrase the best phrasing of that verse as I perceive it. I think that there's something special about the moment, when the moment was ripe, at the exact right instant, Jesus. So God sent his Son, and this is pretty much the Christmas story. Sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law. This whole passage is pretty much a nugget of the gospel. Gospel means good news. This is the good news. This is the good news. We were in slavery. At the right moment, God sent his Son. He came to redeem us through the form of adoption, and then the benefits that come from that, and we'll get back onto that. Okay, so this is, if you wanted to take a synopsis of the entire gospel, say the entire Bible, say the entire history, this passage is a nice little paragraph. And if somebody ever says, what is it you believe, or, what's the gospel? Read for them Galatians 4, 3 to 7, and say, this sums the whole thing up, because this sums up. It doesn't sum up Galatians very well because it's not about Galatians so much, but it does sum up the New Testament and, in a broader sense, the entire Bible and the whole salvific work of God. So at the right time, God showed up in the form of Jesus Christ, born of a woman, born under the law, which is what we've been talking about in Galatians, to redeem those under the law. And that would be the people of Israel at the time, people who were trying to live out a righteous life based on the law that God had given them through Moses, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Now that's kind of the crux of why I'm talking about adoption today, because there's this reference here to adoption to sonship. Now, the sonship thing I think has less to do with gender and more to do with adoption of someone else. So someone adopts somebody else. The word itself is actually, the original word is it's a compound word that means son to place. So it's like to make a son. To make someone who's not a son, or to make someone who's not a child be your child. That's what adoption is, right? I mean, we pretty much all agree with that. Making someone who's not your child to be your child in a legal sense. And it's a legal term. It's a legal enforceable arrangement made between, and it's not really an arrangement between individuals, because the person being adopted is usually not the one who has anything to do with it. And that's where I come back to the gentleman's story about how much work it was to adopt. So he went through all that process of, flying here and going there and paying this and doing that and the paperwork and the on and on and on. It took him, it took him 10 months or a year for the whole thing to go through, and they finally adopted this 10-month-old child from Kazakhstan. But the point that really struck me from what he was saying was that 10-month-old child had nothing to do with it. That may seem kind of strange to say, because it's all about the 10-month-old child. This is this child's life. But the child didn't initiate it. The child didn't pay for it. The child didn't put out any effort. All the child did was poop his diapers and cry. You follow me? And I think that that's super important for us to understand in this story. It is a legal process that has nothing to do with us. We are somehow the joyful recipients of this action that God is taking on our behalf. God took the step of making that which was not his child, namely us, into his child. And that process is a legally binding process, not because there's any higher court that's going to enforce God, but because God follows through on the things that he says he's going to do. And so he has chosen to adopt us as his children, and that is a super powerful thing. Now, we go on to see some of the results of what this means. Because you are his children, it says sons here, because you are his sons, but I think that we have to remember, this is Paul talking to a group of leaders in a church in Galatia, and so they're mostly men, and I don't think that if he was writing today, he would have used that word, but it has nothing to do with, nothing against the, it's a gender-free word. It's used, son is used as, in a general sense in the New Testament, and I think this is one of those cases where it clearly applies. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts. Now he's talking about the Son, the Spirit of a Son, into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. Now maybe you know this, maybe you figured it out. Abba is one of those words that sounds kind of like, Abba, Abba, Abba. That's baby language, right? That's the kind of thing that ma, ma, ma. There's a reason why we choose words that are easy, da, da, da. For words we want our kids to say because he said my name! No, he's just blubbering, but these are the words that are simple to say and children say them. And that's why they kind of fit, and that's why he uses this word. In fact, I read one place that said it would be utterly disrespectful in the time that Jesus was speaking, and probably in the time that Paul was speaking, to use a word like Abba to describe God. Abba is a Hebrew word, and the Hebrew word Abba is probably most closely translated in English today would be dad, or maybe daddy. But it's a word of affection. It's a word of endearment. I remember when my dad would come home when I was a little kid, and we'd hear the door open, and Daddy's home, and run down the hall, and it was this mad mess as he's trying to take his shoes off, and we'd just jump on him, kind of like my dogs jump on me, and we didn't care. We were busy being happy because my dad was home. And now I call him Dad, but Dad is an affectionate word that I use to call him, and there's something odd about somebody who says, Father. We use Dad because it's affectionate, it's loving, it's close. And Jesus says, when we pray this way, and he used the word Father then, but in this setting, Paul is saying not only do we call God our Father, which is there's a big jump from God, the distant one, to being God the Father, and Paul takes a step closer and says, not only is he your father, he's your daddy. He's your dad. He's close to you. It's a word that you use when you climb up on someone's lap and rub their face and feel the prickle of their 5 o'clock shadow. That's what it means. That captures Abba. And that's the kind of relationship that God is wanting to engage with us because he has adopted us into a relationship with him. So the result of this is that we are no longer slaves. Before this, we were slaves to sin, we were slaves to law, we were caught up in something else, but we are no longer slaves. But now we are God's children. And since we are his children, and this is the last interesting word, he has made you also heirs. Now, an heir, of course, is somebody who gets to receive the inheritance. And if you've got parents who are super wealthy, that's kind of a cool thing. And even if you don't, maybe you get the car, and that was kind of cool too. And the thing that gets passed on is, it could be property, it could be a house, it could be whatever, but it gets passed on. But when you're an heir of God, it means something completely different. It's a whole new level of hope, of anticipation, of experience. And I think that's such in contrast with today. Like right now, there's something really scary going on in the world. COVID-19 is on the cusp of becoming one of the great devastating experiences of our time. I think it's not been since the Spanish flu that there was a threat of this kind of danger. And ironically, Spanish flu wouldn't even start in Spain. It's just they were the first ones that really owned up to the fact they had a problem. Owning up to a problem like this is a big deal. And I think that I don't know this, and I sure don't want to be negative, but we face very serious times ahead. It may be that, in the next coming months, we're all going to have to go and we can't meet together as a church, and we have to stay in our apartments and stay away from other people for, 30 days, 60 days, can't go shopping, those kinds of things could become a part of our reality in the very near future. And I realize that we live in a time that's scary. And there are other things that are going on around us too. There's always the threat of war, and there are all these other things that can happen. And we live in a time that could lead us to fear. But I think that passages like this help us to see we don't have to live in fear because we know who's in charge. And we know the relationship we have. And there are going to be times, whether it's this particular epidemic that becomes a pandemic, or someday there's going to be a pandemic, and someday there's going to be a war, and someday bad things are going to happen. But when those bad things happen, we don't have to live in fear. We are no longer slaves to fear because we know that we are children of God and we have been adopted by Him, and we have a hope that is bigger and brighter and clearer than the fear that we have of that which is around us. And there's something powerful that gets inside you when you know that. When you know that it doesn't matter what raging horror is happening around you, because you have a relationship with God, because you've been accepted into a right relationship with Him through adoption. Not because of anything you did, but because of what God did and what Jesus did in coming to earth and giving us that opportunity. So the fact that God reached out to us in this form of adoption, I think, is super powerful. And it reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. I don't know if you've read that passage, but there's at the end of the story, or near the end of the story, the prodigal son, there's a passage where the father's looking, and from a far ways away, he sees his son who's returning. And he pulls his clothes together and he runs. It's that enthusiasm, that love, that energy, that God figure in that story is reaching out in love. And I think that that's what's captured in this particular passage, where it says that that Jesus came born of a woman under the law to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. That's the kind of love that God is expressing toward us. And it's a powerful love that has ramifications. It's not just a love that's a good feeling kind of love. It's a love that makes a difference, that when things are hard, God is there. And when things are difficult, He's still the hope that we have. And we don't even have to fear death, because we have hope for the being heirs, that inheritance that we have in the form of eternal life. So what we're going to do is, I'm not going to go all autobiographical here, but one of the reasons this is super valuable to me is because I think it proves that God loves us. And I know that many of us have already gotten that message. Some of us, it took a little bit longer than others. It took me a long time to figure out that God loves me. And maybe that's hard for you. And if you've already got that figured out, you can just tune out for a second. But if you're still struggling with that, I think it's super important that you realize that it's so much love that He has for you, that He's willing to adopt you in a relationship that will never end, and it is irrevocable. And you are invited into a relationship that causes you to be an heir with Jesus. It also means it turns all of us into a bunch of siblings. So if you're adopted by God and I'm adopted by God, we're both His kids, and that makes us siblings. So you're my brothers and you're my sisters. Maybe you've heard all that before too, but I think that's a super powerful thing. It changes the way we view one another when we know that we're siblings. Siblings sometimes scrap with each other, but we love each other down inside. And I think the same thing's true with the people in this church. Sometimes I scrap with the people in this church. It doesn't mean I don't love you. And I think that you love me, and I think that we have this that's another special ramification that comes out of this, is a recognition that God loves us, and second, a recognition that we are siblings together and that we have a love for one another that's just as well. I think that's super exciting. Not too long ago, something kind of big happened in my life. I have been an Eagles fan ever since I lived near Philadelphia when I was young. And so one time not too long ago, something big happened and there was a big celebration. They finally won the Super Bowl. And that was fun. That was a big celebration. But I think that kind of celebration, although that's kind of a neat thing, eventually we kind of forget and we move on. This is an item that's worth celebrating over in a way that's eternal. And I want to take a little bit of time just to do a little bit of celebrating. And the way I want to celebrate is I want to sing that song that meant so much to me when I first heard it, and that's No Longer Slaves, because I think that song is just about this passage. And I want us to sing this song together, and if we can, I'd like to get a little bit raucous. Just really worship God and recognize I have been accepted as a child of God through adoption, and think of the words of this song as you're singing them in the sense that God has chosen to adopt you and has included you as in the family, and you're sitting together with your brothers and your sisters because we're all adopted together. And during this time, while we're singing the song and even afterward, if you've not had an opportunity to experience this sense of adoption, and you want to know what this is about a little bit further, you want prayer, Kat and Joe are going to be available over here to pray. If you want to pray about anything else, you're welcome to do that too. But this is a time that's sort of, for people who want to pray, you can come over here and pray. For those of you who want to leave, you can leave. For those of you who are excited and want to jump up and down, this is a chance for us just to worship God and rejoice in the fact that we have been adopted together.